We're talking now about the question of apostles today, but first we have to figure out what apostles mean. And actually, there have been a lot of different definitions through history. So, in terms of apostolic succession, many of the older churches, in particular, although some newer ones as well, use it for bishops and some of the newer churches for other kinds of administrative leaders. They speak of that as apostolic kind of authority. Francis Asbury and the U.S. Methodists. Francis Asbury talked about restoring an apostolic kind of church government and going back to apostolic models. Actually, some of the people uh, before that, like I think St. Francis and Wycliffe and some others, I believe, talked about going back to apostolic poverty, like apostolic models of silver and gold have I none, but such as I have, I give you, and so forth. Many churches have applied the language to missionaries and early Pentecostals, and actually some of the holiness circles from which they came. They would speak of apostolic faith, not meaning necessarily that they were apostles, but going back to the apostolic model of the New Testament. Of course, we can talk about going back to the model of Jesus and being conformed to his image, but uh, it's talking about going back to the New Testament. So you have the apostolic faith movement, for example, which was how the Azusa Street revival, early Pentecostals viewed themselves. Now, going back to the early church fathers, usually well, the earliest church fathers, there was a fairly common usage, and that was the 12 plus Paul, which certainly were apostles, but it's hard to come up with just the apostles plus Paul and not others. You can come up with the 12, or you can come up with the apostles, the 12 apostles plus Paul and some others. But it's hard to get just exactly that directly from the New Testament, but we'll go there next. Uh, in the Apostolic Fathers, we call them Apostolic Fathers or speak of the sub-apostolic era, meaning these weren't the original 12 apostles plus Paul, but these were like apostolic-ish, sort of. Anyway, but in the Didache, one of those sources, one of the earliest of those sources, possibly from the 90s of the first century, although First Clement may be from there also. In Didache 11, it speaks of some itinerant ministers as apostles, at least a certain kind of itinerant ministers. And they're sometimes identified, well, in Didache 11, it kind of groups them with some of the prophets. How do you discern true prophets and apostles from false ones? If they ask for money, they're false. That's the criterion in Didache 11. Now, of course, uh, well, all sorts of charities ask for money. And if we did away with asking for money entirely, churches wouldn't be able to support themselves, pay their rent or whatever. You can meet in house churches, but still, if you want anybody to specialize or anything, you've got to support people in ministry. But all that to say, it's actually a good criterion for screening out false apostles and false prophets. Greed is definitely a sign that the person is false, whatever title you give them, unless it's false prophet, in which case they're true false prophet. New Testament usage. The New Testament usage doesn't actually narrow it down quite the way people would like the 12 or Paul or the 12 plus Paul. The Gospels and Acts, you have normally, it refers to the 12. And in Acts 14, it seems to be an exception because twice there, Luke refers to Paul and Barnabas as apostles, but nowhere else in Acts. I was going to say Luke Acts, but Paul and Barnabas aren't in Luke's first volume. Possibly it's implied in the verb apostello. So When Jesus sends out the 70 or the 72, maybe they're apostles in a sense. If apostle means sent ones or delegates, the ancient idea of emissaries, heralds, they were backed by the authority of the person who sent them, and you better not mistreat them. That was throughout the ancient Mediterranean world considered an offense against deity. Of course, it was also an offense against those who sent them. And the penalty for abusing them could be very severe. It could be death. Alexander the Great actually destroyed a city when they executed his messengers against ancient custom and what was considered sacred law. In terms of the definition of the term apostolos, it just means a messenger. But obviously, the Lord has sent all of us. Some people argue from Romans 1:5 that all of us have received an apostleship. Others argue, no, Paul is just speaking with the plural of himself, which in an epistle, in a letter, sometimes you can use an epistolary plural. So possibly he's just speaking of himself. But there's a sense in which we're all sent. We're all commissioned with the Great Commission. So having said that, we need something a bit more precise than being sent, maybe commissioned by the Lord himself directly, but then he had a lot of disciples, and they weren't all called apostles. Some use the particular background of the Hebrew basically equivalent for apostolos, which is shaliach, which means sent one. Now, that kind of idea appears as early as Proverbs. As it's developed in the later rabbis, it's a very particular kind of messenger, backed by the full authority, an agent backed by the full authority of the one who commissioned them, to the extent that they accurately represented their commission. So it wasn't like they had this authority in anything that they did. And so people would arrange marriages through these agents. These agents were commissioned to arrange the marriage, and once they arranged it, it was fully backed up by the authority of the sender, provided they followed the criteria that were given them. Again, that doesn't fully narrow it down. So what I try to do when I look at the New Testament, I can't use just, sent or commissioned, because other people also could be commissioned or sent. Although these seem to be commissioned and sent in a special way, but I try to look at the usage. It's never defined for us in the New Testament, but you look at the usage, well, the Gospels and Acts you've got, usually it refers to the 12. What happens when Judas apostatizes? He gets replaced in Acts chapter 1. And some people say he should have been replaced by Paul, but Paul wasn't even saved yet. And the criteria they give in Acts chapter 1 is that they have to have been with Jesus through the duration of his ministry. So that's a replacement for one of the 12. But in Acts chapter 12, when James, the brother of Jesus, dies, they don't replace him because the criteria were pretty narrow in Acts chapter 1. So you can't go replacing them with people who weren't with Jesus from the beginning. That automatically excludes Paul. Presumably it excludes Barnabas. But in Acts 14, they're apostles, but not like in the sense of the 12, like in Acts chapter 1. So how does Paul use the term? He uses it more broadly, and sometimes he has to defend himself as an apostle because some people seem to question whether he's an apostle. Although Paul can say to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, I believe it's 3, if I'm not an apostle to others, at least surely I'm an apostle to you. I mean, you're the seal of my apostleship. Maybe 1 Corinthians 9. Maybe it's in both. But anyway, he's speaking of a mark of his apostleship in the churches that he founds. He lays foundations, the 12 lay foundations. That's something in common between them. He's a master builder, 1 Corinthians 3, laying foundations. Romans 15:20, He didn't want to minister right away in Rome. He wants to first go where no foundations have been laid, no apostolic foundations have been laid in a whole lot of places, so that's where he goes. Are there places where apostolic foundations haven't been laid today? Now, Calvin, who was cessationist in terms of no more apostles normally, actually was open to the idea, at least in one of his writings, that maybe for some places that need totally to be evangelized today, never been evangelized, maybe there could be apostles, God could raise up apostles with signs for those places. Normally, he didn't seem to think so, because normally he was writing in the tradition, which was big in some of church history, and especially with many of the, well, some of the reformers and some of their successors. They didn't believe that the Great Commission was for today. They didn't believe signs and wonders were for today, because they believed that the world was already completely evangelized by the 12 apostles, and regions that didn't accept the gospel then, no need to evangelize them now. Most of us today don't agree with that. We agree that the Great Commission is for everybody today. But all that to say, yes, many different understandings of apostleship in history. And some of these differences go back to the New Testament itself. I mean, if it can only be the 12, then the 12 have ceased. They're dead. And in terms of people who were with Jesus in his earthly ministry, they're dead, except for Jesus, who's alive again. What about Paul? Well, he wasn't that kind of an apostle. He doesn't meet the criteria of Acts chapter 1. But you've got Paul speaking of himself as an apostle, obviously Romans 1:1 and other places. He also speaks of Barnabas as an apostle in 1 Corinthians 9, where he says, are Barnabas and I the only ones who have to do it this way? All the other apostles do it this way. He also seems to speak of Silas and Timothy, his co-authors in some sense. In 1 Thessalonians 2, he seems to imply that they are also apostles. Galatians 1:19, he speaks of James, the brother of Jesus, as an apostle. Again, he wasn't really converted, so to speak, until he got a resurrection appearance. 1 Corinthians 15, we see before that in John 7 and in Mark 3 and so forth. James wasn't really on board with Jesus' ministry before that. Also, Andronicus and Junia, Romans 16:7. Not everybody is on board with them being apostles. There's a debate about the grammar, but since normally people didn't appeal to the opinion of the apostles, certainly Paul didn't appeal to that anywhere else. And even the church fathers understood them to be apostles, whatever the sense of that. I think personally, Andronicus and Junia are mentioned as apostles in Romans 16:7. That's another can of worms, but I am convinced on that. Paul also uses the term, or a derivative of the term, to speak of pseudo-apostoloi. Like the New Testament, the Old Testament speaks of false prophets. You could have false teachers. Well, you can have false apostles. What characterized the false apostles? 2 Corinthians 10 and 11. They were not, they wanted to be called apostles, but they were building on other people's foundations. We could speak of turf wars. They didn't respect kind of boundaries. Paul had established churches. They came in and wanted to take over churches that Paul and his colleagues established. It's one thing if they invite you to come in and take over, or appoint you, or whatever, or the people vote you in, but that doesn't make you an apostle. It's the establishing of the churches. It's the laying of the foundations that seems to be what's apostolic, breaking new ground. So maybe not even just any kind of church planter, but those who break new ground, fresh areas for the kingdom. And maybe those who actually break ground by starting church planting movements. I mean, we could go on even if we narrow it down, we still need all those kind of things today. Um, as I'm thinking of this and trying to keep this in mind, Philip is, well, there's a Philip the apostle, but the Philip in Acts 6 through 8 and Acts 21, he's called Philip the evangelist, uh, at least once in Acts. He's not called an apostle like the apostle Philip. What do we make of that? I mean, he basically plants the church with signs and wonders in Acts chapter 8, but he doesn't stay there to, build on that foundation. Actually, um, Peter and John come in and help lay hands on people so they can receive the Spirit, so it can be multiplied from there. That's why I say maybe not just planting a church, but also planting a church in a way that empowers it to spread uh, and multiply. In any case, uh, in the book of Revelation, we also read about apostles. So again, false apostles, Revelation 2:2. You've tried those who said they were apostles, but they're not. But why would you have to test them? This comes up also in the Didache, testing apostles. Why would you have to test them if there were only 12? Or why would you have to test them if apostles had already ceased at that point? So the point seems to be, yes, there can be more apostles. But in Revelation 21:14, the New Jerusalem is built on the foundation of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. That's it. That's the 12. There aren't any more of that kind. But Revelation chapter 18 and verse 20, Babylon is judged for what it's done to holy apostles and prophets and saints. Probably not just the 12 at that point. So again, Revelation, like Paul, can use the term in more than one way. What are the qualifications for apostles in the New Testament? Well, they seem to be foundation layers. They seem to plant churches or break new ground in some sense. In Paul's case, in 2 Corinthians 3, clearly the qualification is, yes, he planted the Corinthian church. And it's continued to grow and spread through Achaia, multiple house churches in Corinth and Achaia. In the case of laying foundations, the apostles in Jerusalem obviously broke ground in Jerusalem, but they also laid foundations in a way that nobody after them can do. Well, so long as you include the 12th, the replacement for Judas, nobody after them can do. That is, they were witnesses of the ministry of Jesus. There were other witnesses of the ministry of Jesus, but they were the ones who laid the authoritative, this is what Jesus taught. That doesn't mean that they're the only ones who wrote the New Testament. We don't read that Luke was an apostle. We don't read that Mark was an apostle. Paul was not an apostle in the sense that he actually was with Jesus and can pass on his teachings. But obviously, Paul speaks with an authority in another way. But not everybody who wrote in the New Testament. I mean, Luke wrote 2 big volumes. He's not said to be an apostle. But a number were apostles, but weren't members of the 12, like Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, assuming that he's the author of James. And actually, of the 12, you got, well, taking traditional authorship, which I do in at least some of the cases, maybe a lot of them. Matthew, I'm not going to get into the debates about authorship. The Petrine epistles, Jude is one of the Lord's brothers. He's not said to be an apostle, but James, the Lord's brother, is said to be an apostle. John, who wrote a good bit of the New Testament, again, for those who accept. Anyway, we won't get into all the questions about authorship. I hold traditional authorship for the Gospel of John. That's very controversial among scholars, but let me move on from things less controversial before I get to the big controversial things about apostles. So 2 Corinthians 12:12. Signs and wonders of an apostle were done among you, Paul says, and expected the Corinthians to know exactly what he meant. They had witnessed these things themselves. Uh, but a big one, and actually that one also appears in Matthew 10, and when Jesus sends the apostles in Mark 6, 9 to 13, it also appears in Luke chapter 9, and then when Jesus sends the 70 or 72 in Luke chapter 10. So, yeah, anyway, signs and wonders go with it, although they're not limited to the apostles because Philip and Stephen did them, and so did Ananias, who laid hands on Paul so Paul could receive his sight and be filled with the Spirit. Anyway, we could go on. It's not limited to them. You've got some other gifts like healings and miracles that are listed distinct from apostleship in 1 Corinthians 12, continuing miracles apparently in Galatians 3. But anyway, let's get on with this point. Suffering. Suffering is a major issue for apostles. It's how they prove that they're really in it, not for the money, not for whatever else. They're in it for Jesus, because you have the warning of this in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus sends out the 12, signs and wonders. It's around verse 8 or something. It's like one verse. Got a whole big long section on suffering. Some of it also appears in Jesus' end time discourse in Mark 13, but a big long section of it in Matthew chapter 10. And not only that, but when Paul is talking about his sufferings, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, God has set forth us apostles last of all, and then lists a bunch of sufferings in verses 9 through 13. Now, he says in 1 Corinthians 12:28, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers. I'm in there somewhere, and so on. I like teachers personally. But all that being said, he says apostles are last of all in 1 Corinthians 4. Why? Because he goes on to list their sufferings, and that they get ridiculed and beaten and hungry and thirsty and all these things for the sake of the gospel, spreading the gospel. And then you've got other things he mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Corinthians 1, about himself in particular, 2 Corinthians 4, 2 Corinthians 6, but a big long one in 2 Corinthians 11, which is definitely linked with his apostleship. Contrasted with the false apostles, he says, if I want to boast, hey, let me boast for real. Okay, so they've got this, so do I. They've got this, so do I. Common rhetorical way of arguing in antiquity, by contrasting, comparing. Then he starts into a list, hey, but they don't have any of these. And he goes on and lists his sufferings from verses 22, 23 through 33. Long list of them. Sleepless nights. Sometimes I go through that, but not for always. Suffering for Jesus. Sometimes I just don't sleep well. Sometimes it's indigestion. But the different things we can suffer for Jesus, not just apostles who can suffer those things. I mean, Romans chapter 8, verses 35 to 39, a lot of those things are just sufferings that take place in this world. But apostles like Paul, and like we see with the 12, often suffered specifically for their mission as apostles. Some of us suffer for other missions that we're given. It's not like apostles are like superior to everybody else spiritually necessarily, although they ought to be walking very close to God. But I mean, you can suffer for, look at Jeremiah. He suffered for what he preached in the name of the Lord, for his prophesying in the name of the Lord. You can get run out of town for witnessing to people. You can get run out of town for working for justice or working for feeding the poor. You can get in trouble for all sorts of things. But certainly apostles can expect to get in trouble for their mission. There's going to be a price to pay for the mission. So anyway, something else, moving on. I seem to use anyway as a rhetorical device for moving on to the next point, which is not a very good rhetorical device by ancient standards of rhetoric. But anyway, I should mention here that apostolic authority, yes, there is authority. They're authorized for the commission, but it's not a distinctly administrative authority. So just because you have people working for you, because you have people under you, or maybe because you're overseeing a bunch of churches, doesn't automatically make you an apostle. It's not administrative authority per se. The reason I say that is because you look in Acts chapter 15 and elsewhere in Acts, you see elders. Now, I guess apostles are elders, or at least became elders in some sense as well. Um, 1 Peter 5, Peter is an elder, and certainly Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis in the early second century, speaks of the apostles as elders, and then, not just the apostles, but including the apostles as elders. But in Acts chapter 15, you have the elders in the Jerusalem church. You also have the apostles. The elders of the Jerusalem church had local authority in the Jerusalem church. The apostles had translocal authority, but not because, at least in the case of the 12, that they were appointed by anybody. And I'm not sure you get appointed by people as an apostle. It's more like appointed by God. But I mean, you can still get ordained as a minister, as an apostle. So I mean, hands can be laid on you. Ordination is a whole other issue about what that means. Um, so we don't impose post-New Testament categories on the New Testament. I'm a New Testament scholar, so I need to just be talking about the New Testament, at least mainly talking about that. So the apostolic authority wasn't just local, and it wasn't just administrative. So we've talked about some aspects of that in terms of laying foundations, laying new ground. And like Paul says, I'm not going to try to claim something that people don't see in me. Let people see it in them, they're apostles. So all that to say, we have a number of people who may claim the title today who don't fit. And we have probably a good number of people today who don't claim the title, who do fit the Pauline criteria, not the criterion of, the 12, usually in the Gospels and Acts. Again, they're dead. But let's look at some examples in history. Now, not everybody is going to agree with all these examples. Hope you agree with most of them. St. Patrick, hands down, I think in the Pauline sense, well, you've got legends, but even from the core that we pretty much know is true, St. Patrick, hands down, was an apostle. And I think that's probably true of St. Augustine, the Augustine of Canterbury. I'm not saying it's not true of the other Augustine, but using the narrowest Pauline definition, yeah. Again, there's more than one definition. So by different definitions, different people may qualify. Certainly by the idea of apostolic succession to bishops, both Augustines were apostles. But again, I'm thinking in terms of laying foundations, planting churches. He laid some other foundations, though. Anyway, let me stick with the ones on my list. Francis Xavier, I think, fits that. But those of you who are like, only include Protestants, okay, you're not going to like that. Actually, I could include a whole lot more if I was allowed to. Certainly, many of the of the missionary church planters through the Middle Ages and before the Middle Ages. I mean, we've got a lot of them, but again, I think most people watching the video are probably Protestants. So even though I would count many of these people, uh, well, I would still count many of these people. And so if you don't like it, hopefully you'll forgive me. And if you don't count any of the Protestants, hopefully you'll forgive me for mentioning them too. John Wesley, I think, should by anybody's book be considered apostolic. I mean, certainly he laid foundations, started the church planting movement. Francis Asbury multiplied that even more in the US. I mean, he didn't do it all by himself, but he was one of them. A lot of the circuit riders were doing that kind of thing too. Um, Actually, Jonathan Edwards probably would count as well. Uh, he didn't organize the churches so much, but I mean, he's an evangelist of the first class. But I kind of think sometimes that, I mean, the level at which he did it looks to me anyway. Again, I'm stretching the. Let me just stick with the narrower definition. I think narrower Pauline definition. William Carey, um, certainly he broke a good bit of ground in India, and Adoniram Judson. Right now, I'm just listing people from the Western churches. Um, Most people are doing this groundbreaking foundation laying stuff all over the world today are not from the West. But I also don't know all their names. So I'm using the ones that I know offhand from church history and from, um, well, the next slide we'll talk about some other examples. So Adoniram Judson and at least two of his wives, not simultaneous, but um, yeah, some of them died, were laying foundations in what's now Myanmar and Burma, in especially certain parts of Burma, and some other people were as well. Hudson Taylor certainly started the church planting movement, China Inland Mission. Now, how many of these people would have called themselves apostles? I don't know. Probably most of them would not have. Maybe none of them would have. I'd have to do more research on that. This is, again, not my area of expertise. But by the Pauline definition, they were doing apostolic kinds of work. What about today? Okay, now this is the most controversial part. But some of you actually, you don't like certain groups, and so it's going to be controversial no matter what. Uh, so examples today, I would name Jacques Verneau. He's relatively safe for me to name because most of you don't know him, and so most of you can't complain about him. But Jacques Verneau, uh, he was a church planter, had a major ministry in Congo Kinshasa, and signs and wonders took place through his ministry, bringing people to Christ. I was talking with one person who was writing on somebody who was planting churches earlier in the 20th century there, and that scholar turned out he had spent stayed in Jacques Verneau's home for a time and went with him to a meeting right after arriving in Congo. And while Jacques Verneau was preaching, there was a an African man right beside the person who was sharing this with me, who is Jacques Verneau. Actually, I think he was praying for people to be healed, but he wasn't really where this person was. But it was a sign and a wonder that this person's goiter visibly disappeared right in front of him while Jacques Verneau was praying or preaching, whatever he was doing. I also know other stories of Jacques Verneau because I'm well, I know him. I knew him, but like not like I talked with him a lot, but I also knew his family and I did talk more with them and also knew plenty of other people who were members of his churches or were African ministers were sent out by him to plant churches. I mean, churches were being planted all over the place. He also was a close friend of my father-in-law, so I knew of him that way. Eugene Thomas. Now, some of you are not going to like Eugene Thomas because you think that everybody who's an apostle has to speak in tongues. And I'm going to mention some other people after this. Some of the rest of you will not like them because they do speak in tongues. But in terms of like what Paul mentions about planting churches that spread from there, what seems to be the Pauline definition, as best as I can reconstruct from the New Testament, Eugene Thomas was like that. I mean, he was with a missions organization. I think they were predominantly cessationist. Didn't believe, they certainly wouldn't have believed in apostles today. I don't think Eugene Thomas believed in apostles today either. But what did he do? He would go into places in Congo, Brazzaville. He started churches in the interior, started other ministries. He would go from place to place, take new believers with him, train them, send them out. They would plant churches. I mean, he had a huge impact on that nation. And you say, well, were there any signs and wonders? Yeah, he and his wife talked about him. They didn't credit themselves, and woe to the person who credits themselves for signs and wonders, because that's not what they're for. It's like Peter says in Acts 3, why do you look at us as if by our own power or holiness this man stands before you whole? It's by the name of Jesus. Well, where the gospel is breaking new ground in new areas, God often gets people's attention this way. Like Acts 14, I believe it's 3, where it says that God was doing signs and wonders through the hands of the apostles, confirming the word, the message of his grace, confirming the message. In any case, yeah, we spent time with Eugene and Sandy Thomas. Both of them have passed now, but they shared with us miracles that they experienced. Like one time they were about 100 miles upriver from their base, and the motor on their boat died. And Eugene opened it up and said, uh-oh, the motor's burnt. There's no way it can work. His wife said, let's pray. And he said, honey, I've got a lot of faith, but anyway, if you want to pray, go ahead. She prayed. He pulled the motor and it started. And they went 100 miles on that motor. And when they got to the base, there were people waiting for them on the shore. The motor died and fell into the river. So a couple brothers dove in, pulled out the motor. They pulled it up. They looked at it. They said, this motor's burnt. It can't work. Yeah. It got them to where they needed to go. Another time there was a storm. It was supposed to be not rainy season, and so they were baking bricks to build a church. But if the bricks got wet before they dried or something like that, I'm not an expert in this either, but trying to tell the story the way they told it, except they knew what they were talking about. But anyway, if the bricks got wet, they'd explode at this point. So they prayed. Rain fell all around the bricks, but not on the bricks. And they said their kids were running in and out of the rain, having fun with the selective rainfall. So I also believe Roland and Heidi Baker are good examples of this. I mean, they've cared for thousands of orphans in Mozambique. They went there specifically because it was the poorest nation on earth. I mean, all these people that I've mentioned have gone through suffering and sacrifice for the ministry. Roland and Heidi Baker, they have witnessed signs and wonders. I mean, they'll go, well, right now there's a good bit of, well, let me not go into the details of what's going on now. But what they were doing for a long time. They would go into completely unevangelized villages and they would preach the gospel. Sometimes they would show the Jesus film. Sometimes God would start healing people spontaneously, like during the Jesus film, when somebody got healed, somebody watching the Jesus film would get healed. Or uh, if it didn't happen spontaneously, they'd start calling out uh, to the people in the village, okay, now bring us your deaf people or your blind people. Just like Jesus did in the movie, Jesus can do. And deaf and blind people would get healed. And the next day they'd start a church in the village. I've talked with multiple witnesses, lots and lots of witnesses who witnessed these things happen. And why should that surprise us on the cutting edge of evangelism? And it's not just Roland and Heidi, it's also their Mozambican allies who are church planting. But again, it's Roland and Heidi that I know. So some of you will not agree with me on this figure or that figure, but trying to be consistent with what I see with the New Testament witness, I actually think that there are a lot of people doing this today. But not all the people who use the title are the ones who are doing these things. So again, there are different definitions people use. Some use it just to mean like a bishop. And so if you're going to use that definition, well, we've got plenty of apostles. If you're going to use what I think is the Pauline model, we've also got apostles today. If you're going to use just the 12, no, they're done. So all that to say, I think there are apostles today, but the people who want to use the title for themselves to say, I'm so big, I'm so important, you have to listen to me, you have to do what I say, you have to come under my authority, they kind of fit Paul's category of false apostles. Woe to them.